The Atlantic Ocean had always spoken in whispers. Some nights, its waves rolled gently against the dark rocks beneath the old lighthouse, sounding almost like a lullaby. On other nights, especially during winter storms, the sea roared with such power that it seemed determined to swallow everything in its path. Standing alone on a rocky cliff along the coast of Maine, the old lighthouse had watched over the ocean for nearly a century. Every evening, just before sunset, one man climbed its long spiral staircase. His name was Thomas Carter. At 68 years old, Thomas moved more slowly than he once had. His silver hair danced in the salty wind, and the deep lines across his weathered face told stories that no words ever could. His thick navy coat had faded with time, and his worn leather boots echoed softly against the wooden steps. Yet no matter how tired he felt, he never missed a single evening. As the sky slowly turned shades of orange and purple, Thomas carefully cleaned the giant lighthouse lens with the same attention he had shown for decades. He polished every piece of glass until it shone like crystal. Then he reached for the old switch. With one gentle movement, the great light awakened. A powerful golden beam swept slowly across the endless ocean, cutting through the growing darkness. Thomas watched quietly from the window. There were almost no ships anymore. Modern technology had replaced most old lighthouses years ago. Many people believed this lighthouse should have closed long ago. But every evening, Thomas still lit the lamp. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because anyone paid him. He simply couldn't stop. Below the lighthouse sat a small wooden cottage overlooking the sea. It was simple. Old. Peaceful. Inside, everything remained exactly where it had been for years. A tiny wooden chair. A blue blanket folded neatly beside the fireplace. A shelf filled with seashells collected long ago. And hanging above the fireplace, a faded photograph. Thomas gently picked it up every single night. The picture showed a smiling little girl with bright blue eyes and long golden hair. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her name was Emily. Thomas carefully brushed away the dust from the frame before smiling softly. "Good evening, sweetheart," he whispered. His voice carried no sadness. Only warmth. Only love. Outside, the waves continued their endless rhythm beneath the lighthouse. The evening wind gently rattled the windows. Thomas looked toward the dark horizon where the sea met the fading sky. 30 years had passed. Yet every sunset felt exactly the same. Because before Emily had left all those years ago, she had hugged her father tightly and smiled. "Dad. Promise you'll keep the lighthouse shining. Because one day, I'll find my way home." Thomas had made that promise. And for 30 long years, he had never broken it. The photograph remained in Thomas's hands long after the lighthouse lamp had begun its slow journey across the sea. Emily's bright smile had never faded. Every evening, before going to bed, Thomas would sit beside the fireplace with the picture resting gently on his lap. He never spoke loudly. He simply told her about his day. "The roses finally bloomed again," he whispered. "The seagull stole another fish this morning. And the ocean, it was peaceful today." To anyone else, it might have seemed strange. But to Thomas, it felt as natural as breathing. Because memories were all he had left. 30 years earlier, the lighthouse had been full of laughter. Little Emily loved every corner of it. She would race up the spiral staircase as fast as her tiny legs could carry her, always reaching the lantern room before her father. "Dad," she'd shout with excitement. "I beat you again." Thomas would pretend to lose every single time. "Oh no," he'd laugh. "I guess you're becoming the lighthouse keeper now." Emily would giggle before placing both hands on the giant glass window, staring across the endless Atlantic Ocean. "I wonder what's beyond the horizon," she would ask. Thomas always answered the same way. Beautiful places. Beautiful people. And someday, when you're older, you'll see them all. Emily dreamed of becoming an ocean scientist. She wanted to travel across the world studying whales, dolphins, and sea turtles. Every night before bed, she'd sit beside her father listening to stories about sailors, distant islands, and endless oceans. Those stories filled her heart with wonder. One cool autumn morning, everything changed. Emily had been invited on a school research trip aboard a small educational boat. She had waited months for that day. "Dad," she called while running around the cottage. "I'm finally going." Thomas smiled, even though something deep inside his heart felt unusually heavy. Parents often worry. Even when there's no reason. Before leaving, Emily hugged him tightly. "I'll only be gone a few days," she laughed. Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I know." Then Emily looked toward the lighthouse standing proudly above the cliffs. She pointed at it and smiled. "Dad. No matter where I go. Promise me you'll keep the light on. So I'll always know where home is." Thomas smiled gently. "I promise." Emily grinned. "And I promise. I'll always come back." Those were the last words she ever spoke to him. Because before the boat reached the open sea, dark clouds suddenly covered the sky. And by evening, the Atlantic Ocean became the most violent it had been in decades. The weather forecast had promised only light rain. No one expected what happened next. By late afternoon, the calm blue ocean had completely transformed. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. The wind howled across the cliffs with frightening force, bending trees until they nearly touched the ground. Rain crashed against the lighthouse windows like thousands of tiny stones. Thomas stood inside the lantern room, staring through the storm with a pair of old binoculars. His heart pounded faster with every passing minute. The small research boat carrying Emily should have returned hours ago. Instead, there was only darkness. Only waves. Only endless rain. He reached for the radio again. "This is Lighthouse Point. Can anyone hear me?" Static. Nothing else. He called again. Still. Silence. As night fell, the storm became even stronger. Towering waves crashed against the rocks below with terrifying power. The lighthouse itself trembled beneath the force of the wind. Many people would have extinguished the light and hidden inside. Thomas did the opposite. He turned the great lantern to its brightest setting. Its golden beam fought desperately against the rain, sweeping again and again across the angry sea. "Please. Find your way home," he whispered. Hour after hour, he searched. Every shadow looked like a boat. Every distant wave gave him hope. Every flash of lightning made him believe he had finally seen Emily. But each time, the darkness returned. Near midnight, the village rescue crew arrived. Their faces told Thomas everything before they even spoke. The captain removed his hat. "We found pieces of the boat," he said quietly. "But the storm carried everything too far. We'll continue searching at sunrise." Thomas didn't answer. He simply kept staring toward the ocean. The lighthouse continued turning. Its light never stopped. Morning came. Then another day. Then another week. Rescue teams searched every mile of coastline. Helicopters flew overhead. Fishing boats joined the search. Divers explored the rocky waters. But Emily was never found. The village slowly accepted the heartbreaking truth. A funeral was held without a body. Flowers covered the little church. Neighbors cried. Friends prayed. Everyone believed it was finally time to let go. Everyone. Except Thomas. That very evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Atlantic Ocean, He climbed the spiral staircase once again. He cleaned the giant glass lens. Polished every mirror. And lit the lighthouse exactly as he always had. Because somewhere deep inside his heart, he could still hear a little girl's voice. "Dad. Promise you'll keep the light on. I'll always come back." Thomas intended to keep that promise. No matter how many years it took. The seasons came and went. Spring covered the cliffs with wildflowers. Summer painted the ocean in brilliant shades of blue. Autumn wrapped the hills in gold. Winter buried everything beneath snow. But inside the old lighthouse, nothing changed. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Thomas climbed the spiral staircase with the same slow, careful steps. He cleaned the giant lens. Checked every gear. Filled the old lantern. And as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, he lit the beacon. People from nearby villages often watched the lonely light from miles away. Many admired his dedication. Others quietly shook their heads. "He's still waiting," they whispered. "Poor old Thomas. The sea took his daughter 30 years ago. He'll never accept it." Thomas heard those words many times. He never argued. Because some promises were too sacred to explain. Every night after lighting the beacon, he walked down to the rocky shore carrying a small lantern of his own. He stood at the very place where Emily had waved goodbye for the last time. The waves rolled gently onto the rocks before disappearing back into the darkness. Thomas smiled toward the sea. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "I kept the light on today. Just like I promised." One cold October evening, something unusual happened. As thick fog covered the Atlantic Ocean, Thomas noticed a faint light far out at sea. It wasn't a fishing boat. It wasn't a cargo ship. The light appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Almost as if someone were trying to answer the lighthouse. Thomas raised his binoculars with trembling hands. His heart began to race. For one brief moment, he thought he saw the outline of a tiny wooden boat drifting silently through the mist. He took one step forward. Then another. The strange light slowly faded into the fog, leaving the ocean dark once again. Thomas stood there for several minutes without moving. Most people would have called it imagination. A tired old man's fading hope. But deep inside, something felt different. For the first time in 30 years, the ocean no longer felt completely silent. And somewhere beyond the endless fog, it almost seemed as though someone was finally trying to find the light. The strange light haunted Thomas's thoughts for days. He tried convincing himself it had only been a reflection. Perhaps moonlight dancing across the waves. Perhaps an old fishing buoy drifting through the fog. But deep inside, his heart refused to believe that explanation. Every evening after lighting the lighthouse, Thomas found himself staring longer at the horizon. His eyes searched every wave. Every shadow. Every distant sparkle upon the sea. Even Rusty seemed to notice the change. The old horse would quietly stand beside the cliff, facing the ocean as though waiting for someone to. One cold morning, after a night of heavy rain, Thomas walked along the rocky beach collecting driftwood. Storms often washed strange things onto the shore. Broken barrels. Pieces of fishing nets. Old bottles. Even small wooden crates. As he slowly crossed the wet sand, something caught his attention. Half buried between two dark rocks lay a small wooden box. Its surface was worn smooth by years in the ocean. Seaweed clung tightly to its sides. Thomas carefully lifted it into his arms. It was surprisingly heavy. The old brass lock had rusted away long ago. With trembling hands, he gently opened the lid. Inside, Everything was soaked except for one small object wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Thomas unfolded the faded cloth. His heart stopped. It was a tiny silver seashell necklace. Emily's necklace. He would have recognized it anywhere. He had given it to her on her 8th birthday. Tears slowly filled his eyes. His fingers shook as he held the little necklace beneath the morning sunlight. Beneath it, he noticed something else. A folded piece of yellowed paper. The edges were damaged by water, but the writing inside remained just clear enough to read. Thomas slowly opened it. The handwriting was small, neat, and painfully familiar. His breathing became uneven. Because before reading a single sentence, he already knew whose handwriting it was. At the very top of the page, only 3 words remained perfectly untouched by time. Dear Dad. Thomas closed his eyes. For 30 long years, he had waited for a sign. Now, the ocean had finally returned one. Thomas's hands trembled so badly that he almost dropped the fragile letter. For several long moments, he simply stared at the faded words. The ocean breeze gently moved the paper between his fingers. His heartbeat echoed louder than the crashing waves. Slowly, very slowly, he began to read. Dear Dad. If you're reading this, it means the sea finally decided to bring my letter home. Thomas's breathing stopped. Tears blurred every word. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve before continuing. The storm was stronger than anyone expected. Our boat was carried far away from the coast. Some of us survived, but we couldn't return home. Thomas felt his knees grow weak. For 30 years, he had believed his daughter had disappeared forever. Yet these words told another story. Emily had survived. She had lived. The letter continued. Dad. I never stopped looking for the lighthouse. Every evening I searched the horizon, hoping to see your light. Whenever I felt afraid, I remembered your promise. Thomas pressed the paper against his chest. A quiet sob escaped his lips. Please don't blame yourself. None of this was your fault. You gave me the happiest childhood anyone could ever have. His tears fell onto the faded page. He carefully wiped them away before the ink could disappear. The final lines were harder to read. Time and seawater had nearly erased them. But Thomas could still make out the words. If I never find my way home, please keep smiling whenever you see the ocean. Because every sunset will remind me of you. Then. The last sentence. Barely visible. Almost gone. I love you, Dad, more than the sea itself. Thomas closed his eyes. For the first time in 30 years. He wasn't crying because of loss. He was crying because he finally knew the truth. Emily had never forgotten him. She had carried his love. Until her very last day. The old lighthouse keeper looked toward the endless Atlantic Ocean. The evening sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon. Without saying a single word, he climbed the spiral staircase once again. And as darkness covered the sea, the lighthouse beam shone brighter than ever before. Not because he was still waiting, but because now, he understood exactly why Emily had wanted the light to stay on. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. The letter remained on the old wooden table beside Emily's faded photograph. Again and again, he read every word, as though he feared they might disappear by morning. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean was unusually calm. The lighthouse beam swept silently across the dark water, just as it had done for the past 30 years. But everything felt different now. For decades, Thomas had believed he was keeping a promise for someone who would never return. Now he realized. Emily had seen that light. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, during her darkest nights. She had looked toward the sea and searched for the lighthouse. His promise had reached her. Even if he never knew it. A gentle smile appeared on Thomas's face. For the first time in years, his heart felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because love had finally answered the questions that grief never could. The next morning, the villagers noticed something unusual. Thomas wasn't standing silently by the shore. Instead, he was planting tiny white flowers around the base of the lighthouse. Children ran over curiously. "Mr. Thomas," one little girl asked. "Why are you planting flowers here?" Thomas looked toward the ocean before smiling warmly. "So that everyone who visits this lighthouse remembers that love always finds its way home." The little girl smiled and helped him press another flower into the soft earth. Soon, more children joined. Then their parents. By sunset, the lonely lighthouse was surrounded by hundreds of white blossoms gently moving in the sea breeze. No one called Thomas crazy anymore. Instead, people began calling the lighthouse Emily's Light. Travelers stopped to hear the story. Sailors quietly removed their hats whenever they passed. Parents held their children's hands a little tighter. And every evening, as the golden light stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, Thomas whispered the same words he had waited 30 years to say. "You found your way home, sweetheart. Not with your footsteps, but with your love." The lighthouse continued shining. Not because someone was lost, but because hope should never disappear from the horizon. Several months passed. The story of Emily's Light spread far beyond the coast of Maine. Travelers, sailors, and families came from distant towns just to see the lonely lighthouse that had become a symbol of hope. Thomas welcomed everyone with the same gentle smile. He never charged money. He never asked for attention. He simply listened to people's stories, offered them a warm cup of tea, and reminded them to never stop loving the people who mattered most. One quiet autumn afternoon, an elderly woman arrived carrying a small leather suitcase. She walked slowly with the help of a wooden cane. Her silver hair danced in the cool ocean breeze. When she reached the lighthouse, she stopped for several moments, silently staring at the white flowers surrounding it. Then, she quietly whispered, "Emily." Thomas heard the name immediately. His heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer. "Did you know my daughter?" The old woman looked at him with tearful eyes. "I did." Thomas froze. For 30 years. No one had ever spoken those words. The woman gently opened her old suitcase. Inside were several carefully wrapped belongings. A faded blue ribbon. A tiny seashell. And an old photograph. Thomas picked it up with trembling hands. It showed Emily. A little older than when she had left home. She looked happy. Standing beside several people on a distant shoreline. Thomas could barely breathe. Where was this taken? The woman smiled softly. On a small island. After the storm. Thomas's eyes filled with tears once again. The woman slowly sat on a wooden bench overlooking the sea. "My name is Margaret," she said. "I was one of the survivors." Thomas sat beside her without saying a word. For the next several hours, Margaret told him everything. How the storm had carried them hundreds of miles away. How Emily never stopped talking about her father. How every evening she climbed the island's highest cliff, searching the horizon for one tiny light. Margaret lowered her head. She truly believed that as long as your lighthouse was shining, you were still waiting for her. Thomas looked toward the endless ocean. His promise had never been in vain. Not even for a single night. Margaret held the old photograph carefully in her hands. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the waves filled the silence between them. Finally, Margaret looked toward the lighthouse. "There was something Emily wanted you to know," she said softly. Thomas slowly turned to face her. His hands rested quietly on his knees. His heart was beating so loudly that he could hardly hear the wind. Margaret smiled through her tears. "After the storm, we reached a small island. There were only a few families living there. They welcomed us and cared for everyone who survived. Emily was frightened at first. But every evening, she would climb the highest cliff on the island." Thomas already knew why. "She was looking for the lighthouse," he whispered. Margaret nodded. "Yes. She believed that if your light was still shining, it meant you were still waiting." Thomas closed his eyes. For 30 years. Every single night. He had lit that lamp. And somehow, his daughter had seen its meaning, even from far away. Margaret reached into her suitcase once more. This time, she removed a small notebook with a faded blue cover. Emily kept a diary. She wrote in it almost every day. Thomas carefully opened it. The pages were worn but still readable. One entry caught his eye immediately. "Tonight I couldn't see Dad's lighthouse, because of the fog. But I know it's still there. Dad always keeps his promises." Another page read, "If I ever make it home, I'm going to hug Dad for a very long time." Thomas couldn't stop the tears. Margaret gently placed her hand over his. "She never stopped loving you. Not even for a single day." Thomas looked toward the endless Atlantic Ocean. The pain in his heart was still there. It always would be. But now, it was no longer filled with unanswered questions. It was filled with memories. With love. With peace. As the evening sun slowly disappeared beyond the sea, the lighthouse beam began its familiar journey across the dark water once again. And for the first time, Thomas smiled at the horizon. Not because he was still waiting for Emily to return. But because, at last, he knew she had never truly left his heart. That evening, after Margaret had left, Thomas remained alone inside the lighthouse. The diary rested gently beside Emily's photograph. For hours, he turned its pages slowly, reading every sentence his daughter had written. Some pages spoke about the sea. Some described the birds that visited the island every morning. Others were filled with simple memories of home. "Dad makes the best hot chocolate. I miss watching sunsets from the lighthouse window. I hope Rusty still remembers me." Thomas smiled through his tears. It felt as though Emily were sitting beside him again, telling him about her day. Near the end of the diary, he found one final page. The handwriting was weaker than before, but every word was clear. "If this diary ever reaches my father, please tell him not to spend the rest of his life waiting for me." Thomas's hands began to tremble. He continued reading. "Dad, you gave me a childhood filled with love. Because of you, I was never afraid of the dark. Your lighthouse taught me that no matter how lost someone feels, there is always a light somewhere guiding them home." A tear rolled silently down Thomas's cheek. Then he reached the final lines. "Promise me one last thing. Keep the lighthouse shining. Not for me anymore, but for every soul who feels lost in this world." Thomas closed the diary and held it against his heart. For 30 years, he had believed he was lighting the beacon for only one little girl. Now he understood. Emily had wanted that light to become hope for everyone. That night, Thomas climbed the spiral staircase one more time. As the giant lantern came alive, its golden beam stretched across the endless Atlantic Ocean. He looked toward the stars and smiled gently. "I promise, Emily. From tonight, this light belongs to everyone." Outside, the waves whispered softly against the cliffs, as if the ocean itself had finally found peace. Years quietly passed. The lighthouse no longer stood as a forgotten tower on a lonely cliff. People traveled from every corner of the country to visit Emily's light. Some had lost their parents. Some had lost their children. Others carried silent pain that no one else could see. They came because they had heard the story of an old father who never stopped believing in love. Thomas welcomed every visitor with the same gentle smile. He would pour them a warm cup of tea, invite them to sit by the fire, and simply listen. He discovered that sometimes people didn't need advice. They only needed someone who would listen without judging. Soon, the lighthouse became more than a guide for ships. It became a place where broken hearts slowly began to heal. One snowy December evening, a young boy knocked on Thomas's door. He couldn't have been older than 10. "My mother passed away last month," he whispered. "I don't know how to stop missing her." Thomas looked at the frightened child for a long moment before leading him to the top of the lighthouse. Together they watched the great beam sweep across the dark ocean. "Do you know why this light shines?" Thomas asked. The boy shook his head. Thomas smiled softly. "It reminds us that even when someone we love is gone, their love never disappears. The light keeps traveling. Just like their love." The little boy stared silently at the horizon. Then he slowly smiled through his tears. "I think Mom would like this place." Thomas gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I think so too." That night, as snowflakes drifted through the cold air, Thomas realized something beautiful. Emily's final wish had come true. The lighthouse was no longer waiting for one lost daughter. It had become a light for every lost heart. And every evening, as the golden beam reached across the Atlantic Ocean, someone, somewhere, found hope because of it. Winter arrived quietly. The ocean was calm. The lighthouse still stood proudly above the rocky cliffs, its golden light sweeping across the Atlantic every single night. Thomas was now 80 years old. His steps had grown slower. His hands trembled more than before. But every evening, just before sunset, he climbed the spiral staircase one final time. The villagers often offered to do the work for him. Thomas always smiled. "As long as I can take one more step," he would say, "I'll keep my promise." One peaceful evening, after lighting the great beacon, Thomas carried Emily's photograph and her diary to the lantern room. He placed them beside the glowing window. Outside, the sky slowly filled with thousands of stars. The sea whispered gently below. For a long time, he simply watched the horizon. Then, through the soft golden light, he smiled. It almost felt as if a little girl in a blue dress was standing far away, waving at him with the same bright smile she had worn 30 years ago. Thomas closed his eyes. "Emily, I kept the light on. And thank you for teaching me that love never sinks." A gentle breeze flowed through the lantern room. The pages of Emily's diary turned by themselves until they stopped on her final message. "Keep the lighthouse shining, for everyone." Thomas smiled one last time. His breathing became slow. Peaceful. Without fear. As the lighthouse continued sending its warm light across the ocean, Thomas quietly slipped into eternal sleep. The next morning, the villagers found him sitting peacefully in his old chair. A gentle smile remained on his face. His hand rested on Emily's diary. Outside, the lighthouse still shone. From that day forward, the people of Maine never allowed its light to go out. Because they believed. Some lights are not meant to guide ships. They are meant to remind us that true love never disappears. It simply becomes a light, guiding every lost heart safely home. Crescent Moon, the end.